Hello everyone, I'm Michaela Kathleen, and in this video, I'm doing my November reading wrap-up. So to start off with, I did finally finish The Two Towers. It's taken me a very long time to get through this. I'm only reading a little bits here and there. So yeah, it took me the entire year pretty much to read the first two books in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I gotta say, I think I like the first book better. The second book felt even slower, but maybe that's just because I've been reading it for so long at this point. But anyways, for books that I actually read exclusively in November rather than over the course of about 6 months, the first one of those was Britt Marie Was Here by Fredrik Backman. I have been slowly working my way through all of Fredrik Backman's books. I've been reading one of his books every year in November for a few years now, and Britt Marie is one that I've been wanting to get to for a while, but I kept just not seeing it at the bookstore when I would go to pick up a Backman book. But the reason I've been so excited to try this one is because it looked the most similar to A Man Called Ove, which was my first and still remains my favorite Backman book. But one fun thing is I did read My Grandmother Asked Me to Tell You She's Sorry last year, which featured Britt Marie. So it was fun to have that context, which I wouldn't have had otherwise. And this one did definitely have Ove vibes as expected. Britt Marie is a curmudgeonly old woman, very similar to Ove, who's a curmudgeonly old man. But she is also definitely her own character, and I just love the way that Backman characters think. I like their thoughts. Their internal monologues are always so interesting and entertaining and usually funny too. And this one also had a lot of emotional metaphorical resonance, which was nice. In this book, Britt Marie ends up kind of accidentally coaching a children's soccer team, even though she arguably does not like soccer. And there was this kind of repeating metaphor about what being a fan of various teams meant about you as a person. And that was kind of one of my favorite parts of the book. Every time we'd get a new team and what that meant about that person, I was very excited. I swear I'm between John Green and Ryan Reynolds and Ted Lasso and Fredrik Backman. I think I'm gonna have to be a soccer fan, even though, like Britt Marie, I'm not interested in sports at all. But all that being said, this one was a bit slower than A Man Called Ove for me, and A Man Called Ove is also a fairly slow book itself. Most Backman books are on the slower side. They're a lot more about character introspection than flashy action, but this one was just even more on the slow side for me. So I didn't like it as much as Ove or My Grandmother Asked Me to Tell You She's Sorry, but I did still, I think, like it better than Beartown. But maybe that's just because I don't have the idea of an entire trilogy hanging over my head with this one. Now that I'm done with it, I am done with it until I want to reread this one. So yes, still loving my Backman journey. Definitely still loved this one, even if it was a little slow, and looking forward to seeing which Backman book I pick up next year. And then after Britt Marie Was Here, I read the entire Inkheart trilogy. This was a reread for me. I have read Inkheart countless times. This was a childhood favorite. I never liked the second or the third one as much as the first one. So part of this reread was figuring out if I wanted to keep the second and the third books or just hold on to the first book. I was a little bit worried going into this that I wouldn't even like the first book because I recently tried a Divergent reread and even the first book was not enjoyable for me, but I did still enjoy the first one in this case. And this is a series about a character who, when he reads aloud from books, things from inside the book will come out into the real world, and something from the real world will go into the book to take its place. And yeah, for me, it's just the concept with this one. It is my favorite, maybe, book concept that I have ever encountered. It's obviously a book for readers. It is a book that loves books. This first one totally held up. It is a little bit slow. All of the books in the series are slow, but in this first one, I don't mind it so much. And I think everything that's in it is earned. And yeah, I just have always really loved the characters. Dustfinger is my favorite, and just the magic and the fairy tale-ness that it has. So definitely holding on to this first one. Will not be getting rid of this one. But moving on to Inkspell and Ink Death, I will not be holding on to these. Inkspell has even more fairy tale vibes than Inkheart, for sure, but it is just so much slower, and it's so long. And like this, the second one wasn't horrible, but it's definitely a huge letdown because in this one, spoiler alert, the characters themselves are going into the book from the first book. The first book takes place completely in the real world, and in this one they're going into the book. And so it should be so much more fun and magical, but it's just a slog. It does, for me, have Howl's Moving Castle and The Princess Bride kind of vibes, kind of modern fairy tale vibes. It also has a little bit of questionable stuff in it in the same way that Howl's does. As far as just some of the ways it talks about some of the characters, you're just like, oh, books nowadays don't talk about characters or describe characters in this way because it's just not necessary. But yeah, mostly my overall vibe from this one is that it's just too long. And then times that by about 10 for Ink Death. It is a thick boy. I think part of what doesn't help this one is that it feels much more like a continuation of the story from the second book than the second book is from the first book. The first book takes place completely in the real world, and we have a pretty big time jump, a whole year between the first and the second book, and so the stories feel very separate. Like, this could stand by itself, whereas this one could not, and these two both take place pretty much completely in the book world, and there's not a time jump with Ink Death, and so it does very much feel like a continuation of the story from Inkspell, which just increases the amount that it feels like it drags on and on. Like, I was so bored up until the death scene in this third book, and that doesn't happen until like 250 pages in. Up until that point, I had no interest in anything that was happening. The death scene in it was pretty cool, but it wasn't like, it didn't blow me away. I wish that the book had actually drawn more on that scene, done more with that scene. I hated what was done with Eleanor's character in the second and the third book. For all of the second book, she is stuck, left behind in the real world while everyone else is in the book world. And she's a good character, and so, I mean, I don't know what I would want to have been done with her character instead, but we just, for all of this book, would occasionally get scenes that would flash back to the real world to show like, yep, Eleanor's still stuck there and she's still upset about it and there's nothing she can do about it, until finally in the third book she does get to the book world, which that in itself, the rules for, I guess you can call it the magic system, the reading aloud thing in this series become so lax by the third book. Like, things from the world that you're in don't have to disappear from that world anymore when you're reading things out of books, even though that was a rule at the beginning of the series that like things go into the books when you read things out, and it's kind of a sacrifice sometimes because you don't know what you're gonna lose. That just totally disappears. At the beginning in Inkheart, sometimes reading aloud would work, sometimes it wouldn't. By the third book, it just always works exactly how you want it to, pretty much. And then like also there's this one character who really insists that you can't read yourself into a book, but not only does our main character do it, but then this side character who's supposed to be not as good as everyone else at this skill manages to do it. So like, just where are the rules? I did really struggle not to DNF the third book, but I honestly could not remember how it ended. I think I have only read this one once before, whereas, you know, Inkheart countless times and Inkspell a few times. So I really could not remember how the third book ended, so I did want to know how the whole series ended since I couldn't remember. But yeah, it was a struggle. And the ending, I liked it. I did kind of see it coming, which might have partly been, you know, buried memory of it, but might have just been like, there were clues. I do kind of like who ends up defeating the villain, because it's just so deeply the villain's own fault, which is nice. And then the very last chapter, spoiler alert, our main character gets like a new little brother, and the very last chapter is kind of just showing like him growing up in the book world, and he wants to travel to the real world because he thinks it sounds so magical and cool. And it's just a kind of a nice ending that like the real world has kind of become the fairy tale world for our characters. But speaking of our main character, much like Eleanor, Meggie is hardly in the third book. She has almost no effect on anything that happens in the third book, which I hate. I like Mo, her dad, who kind of ends up becoming the main character instead of her, but not enough. I don't like him enough to want him to be the main character. Like, I like Meggie. I want her to be the main character. And her, like, romance storyline didn't feel fleshed out enough. To me, if we were gonna get a new romance aside from the one that she had already started to establish in Inkspell, that romance should have had more to it. Otherwise, it was just like, why was it there? I did find a new ship on this reread that I doubt that I had as a child, but Violante and Brianna, the princess and her maid, oh my god, what a cute couple they would be. I quite liked Violante. She was a very interesting character. Brianna was kind of neither here nor there for me, but I definitely liked Violante, and I think with Brianna, they would have been cute. But yeah, that was my reread of the Ink World trilogy. As expected, I just did not enjoy the second and the third books for exactly the reason that I remembered, which is that they are slogs. They are so slow. The first one itself is a little slow, and then these two are just insane. But I was happy that I do still like the first one. I'm still gonna hold on to the first one. I'm sure I'll reread it again someday, and I will be perfectly satisfied with this being the entire story for me. So yeah, those were all of the books that I read in November. Let me know down below what you read in November, and if you're planning any fun Christmas reads for December. I hope you enjoyed watching. Remember, words matter.